biggest risk in scaling isn't just burning yourself out, it's focusing on the low leverage tasks that steal your energy where it could be better placed in growing your business. My name is Fari, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through the system behind decision fatigue, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I'm actively implementing it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. So every decision you make takes cognitive energy. The problem isn't that it's the decisions itself, but rather it's a lack of a system that reduces the low leverage choices that you make on a day-to-day basis so that you can focus on the high leverage tasks. And I've spoken about this a couple times, basically trying to move from, basically doing each and every single moving task by myself and just moving towards, being a architect of leverage, basically leveraging that to say, hey, if we're going to scale and we're going to be able to, handle the volume that we're going to be handling into the future in terms of data and output as well, we need to make sure that we have structure in and around how we're basically able to rank, what it is that we need to basically automate, delegate, and also things that I just need to take in a, approach to saying, hey, I'm going to handle this by myself. And in order to do this is just my simple way of, basically breaking it down into three simple, ways of thinking it and saying, hey, number one, level one is automating the repetitive client decisions. How can we actively think about the onboarding process? Say, hey, we're basically onboarding the client and then we send them a Loom video to say, hey, welcome. This is how we're basically going to be, making sure that you get from your current position to your dream state, and ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're automating this. So as soon as they sign, we set an auto trigger that automatically sends them, say, hey, the billing, or even just that Loom video that we're sending them, and saying, hey, reporting as well. We need to make sure that we're, actively, automating the reporting process that we have. Say if we have an application and then on a monthly basis, we need to see how it is also, just performing. We need to make sure that we're also able to just, automate that reporting process, because through that is something that, is on a low leverage or low leverage task that I can be handling on a day-to-day. And understanding that also through this, we need to make sure that we're also just automating follow-ups, basically the follow-ups that we have to say, hey, I hope everything is going, just weekly check-ins to say, hey, we're having weekly check-ins. Now we can schedule a call to go more in depth in what it is that we're actively, attempting to solve that week or that specific day, and saying, hey, the main focus is to make sure that, a client should not be asking what's next. And if they do, we need to make sure that we're building a workflow or a portal that answers that question once and for all. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that, hey, a client should never be asking next. We say, hey, thank you for onboarding, they paid and everything else. And then they say, hey, what is next? They should also automatically understand that, hey, we're sending them a Loom video that also allows us to understand that, hey, this is how we're able to, take your business to the next stage, and also making sure that they understand that we're on the same page. Because once a client starts asking, what's next after they've signed, then clearly there's a problem. We could do a much better job in that. And this is something that, in the beginning I was, not personally like thinking about it super deep in detail, but now just understanding that, hey, automation is not equal to cold, but rather you can layer a layer of personalization in this, basically understanding that, you can add a pre-scheduled check-in or customized dashboards so that it still feels human. Because also understanding that, hey, in as much as we can build automation and we can do all these things, it is still does not have that human aspect of it. And how can we actively incorporate those different human aspects of it that also ultimately allows our clients to feel connected? Because in as much as, it's a transaction of business and things like that, I think the human connection will still play a vital role in every single aspect that we're actively, building and, solving for. Then the question just becomes, how can we personalize this to the stage where it is, as human as we possibly can, so that it just doesn't feel cold. And I think through that, just taking that personalized approach, I think we're going to get a lot further, in just actively just, when we're scaling this into the future. But through that also, then we move into the next layer, which is delegation in mid-tier choices. So now this is not the automation layer, but now we're taking a step up to say, hey, what are the things that we actively need to, basically, delegate delegate. And through asking this, we can then say, hey, an example of this is design revisions, rescheduling, formatting deliverables. And through this, you need to make sure that we're actively understanding that a client shouldn't need you for these. You should train your team or build an SOP around it for someone to handle it. And through this, you can even use Data Google Studio to say, hey, they're actively looking at the data, what is going on, and then pulls all the different metrics that we need, so that it's just one consolidated dashboard. And through that, then we should be able to say, hey, this is what needs to be done, XYZ. So it's not just me just coming in and making sure that each and every single moving part needs my specific input, but rather that we can basically be able to delegate this. And I think this is also the most important most, because we need to separate what we need to automate and what we need to delegate, which are mid-tier choices. And understanding that, hey, for this, we basically build dashboards, and through these dashboards, we allow the team to, or me specifically, to take a look at the metrics and say, hey, XYZ is dropping, why doesn't this specific team member then handle it? And through that is basically delegating these mid-tier choices, and that also automatically allows that decision fatigue to be reduced a lot less. And I think one of the most important things is understanding that decision fatigue, especially for me, that I've experienced in my journey, is that I could be doing each and every single moving part, but I think having a system and having a process in terms of how we're basically segmenting this to say, hey, we have an automation layer, we have a delegation layer, and then we have the preservation of my energy, the founder energy, for high leverage client decisions that we need to take. If we are basically able to separate this, and then also understand that, hey, for XYZ decisions, we need to make sure that we're automating, or we need to make sure that we're delegating. And I think through this, we're going to reach a new level of awareness that's ultimately going to allow us to have more structure, because in as much as you can do all these things manually, I think that structure is going to play a vital role. And also constantly just seeing how we can actively help the clients that we're working with to also just understand that, hey, different decisions automatically or also need to be ranked to say, hey, this needs to be automated, this needs to be delegated, and this specifically needs to preserve the founder's energy, because you can only make so many decisions on a daily basis. But through this mid-tiered choices, you are also automatically able to then say, hey, my role then specifically becomes that I need to make sure that I'm oversighting. I'm also able to see, hey, this is what's going on with the ads that we're spending in, for example, or this is what's going on with the client revisions, or this is what's going on with the scheduling, or how many clients we've onboarded. These are the metrics, XYZ. Just basically understanding that my key role is then basically being able to have that oversight and quality control, and also protecting brand consistency. Because in as much as I can be doing so many things on a day-to-day basis, just making sure that I'm protecting that brand consistency also automatically just allows us to scale a lot further, because there's so many things that need to be done on a day-to-day basis. And in as much as you have 24 hours, you cannot do every single thing. And this is one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately, to say, hey, how can we actively scale this up in terms of the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis, and just make this process a lot better, in understanding that, hey, there's so many energy, you can do 1,000,001 things in a day, but there should be only 3 things that ultimately move the needle, and we should be attacking on those 3 things. And solely just understanding that, hey, for me, I need to make sure that I'm mainly focusing on making sure that we have as less decision fatigue as possible, not just for me but also for the team, to make sure that, hey, everyone understands their role and there's a high level of clarity. And through that, we're also automatically able to then push the needle a lot further in terms of building Killer Chaos OS. And through that then comes the preservation of the founder's energy for high leverage client decisions, which I think is one of the most important things that I focus on a day-to-day basis. And I think it should be one of the most important things that at this present moment in time, when you don't, have to focus on too much. This is one of the most key things. I know when you're starting out, you kind of have to focus on every single thing, but then I think, it's just moving across these three. And then one of the things that, I, solely just, am super bullish and focusing on a lot more is just making sure that, in the preservation of the founder energy, that I'm basically focusing on, pricing strategies, client selection, major pivots, long-term contracts, basically saying, hey, I'm the vision or the overall, person that, puts these strategies, the overarching strategies, and also just make sure that the ship is running as well. And also client selection to say, hey, these are the level of clients that we're going to be working with, and also major pivots to say, hey, we want to pivot into a new direction. We want to make sure that, hey, we're staying on top of every single thing in terms of what it is that we're building, and just also making sure that I'm focusing on the high leverage tasks that move the needle on a day-to-day basis. Because through that, then that means that these decisions are ultimately directly, correlated or shaped to the growth, margin, and positioning, which is one of the most important modes to say, hey, I'm actively focusing on the growth of the business. I'm focusing on the, margins that we're actively having, and the positioning as well. Because in as much as, you can focus and hop back and forth between, the delegation and the preservation, I think one of the most important needle movers, or in this, three-part stage, is also just within, preservation of the founder energy. And through that, I also like to focus mainly on this specific part to say, hey, there are times where I may need to, make sure that I'm getting in the weeds a little bit and focusing on delegation, and then coming back and then doing all these things. Sure, that's 100% fine, but in the long term, I don't think that's sustainable. So it's basically just asking, what can I do today that ultimately builds that, future where I'm just solely focusing on the preservation of my decision fatigues. And I think this is ultimately going to play a key role once I get it all figured out. But right now I think it's in a solid place, but I think it still can be a lot better. But through that, understanding that if you're spending energy on, can we move this meeting today to Thursday, you also you're basically making sure that, hey, you'll have nothing left for the moves that actually compound your business. Basically understanding that, hey, you need to focus on the high leverage decisions that ultimately move the needle. And if you're not on a day-to-day basis, you won't have enough energy to build that compounding effect that ultimately moves the needle. And through that, the outcome of all of this is that if you're only pulled into the conversations, you need to make sure that you're only pulled into the conversations that protect revenue or growth. Because I think these are the one or two things that you should be focusing on, to saying, hey, I need to be focused on the conversation that protect revenue and grow the business as well, and making sure that instead of deciding each time how to onboard a client, we basically build a checklist / system so that the decision is already made, so that we have this checklist and we are basically able to implement it straight away, instead of debating the daily schedule to say, hey, what is going to get done, should we block this as a deep work session and all that. We basically pre-block the deep work hours each and every single week. And then understanding that decision fatigue isn't a willpower problem, it's a systems problem. And reducing the low leverage choices that you make can ultimately fully show up, so that you can ultimately fully show up for the ones that actually move the needle, is going to be the mode that we're actively going to be pushing a lot further into the future. And I know we're still getting super technical and more in depth about this, and we're going to make so many mistakes, but the most important things is that we're going to get these data points that ultimately allow us to move closer to the grand vision of Killer Chaos OS. And through that, we're going to get so many things wrong, but the things that we are going to get right, we're just going to make sure that we're hitting them on the nail and making sure that we're moving forward each and every single day. And I think through this is going to be the source of truth, specifically for me and the team as well, to say, hey, this is what needs to be done from a high level, and also making sure that we are having this process in terms of decision fatigues super dialed. Because in as much as for me, I may understand it, I think it's also super important for the team to understand that, hey, these XYZ choices should come to me, or should be filtered to me, or they should be filtered mainly to whoever else is on the team. And making sure that this is the mode that we're going to use to scale into the future. Like I said, we're going to get so many things wrong, but the things that we are going to get right, we're going to make sure to hit them in the nail, and just constantly keep moving the needle forward. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.